One day Mrs. Hopewell had picked up one of the books the girl had just put down, and, opening it at random, she read, "Science, on the other hand, has to assert its soberness and seriousness afresh and declare that it is concerned solely with what is. Nothing. How can it be for science anything but a horror and a phantasm? If science is right, then one thing stands firm. Science wishes to know nothing of nothing. Such is, after all, the strictly scientific approach to nothing. We know it by wishing to know nothing of nothing." These words had been underlined with a blue pencil, and they worked on Mrs. Hopewell like some evil incantation and gibberish. She shut the book quickly and went out of the room as if she were having a chill. This morning, when the girl came in, Mrs. Freeman was on caramel. "She thrown up 4 times after supper," she said, "and was up twict in the night after 3 o'clock. Yesterday she didn't do nothing but ramble in the bureau drawer. All she did, stand up there and see what she could run up on." "She's got to eat," Mrs. Hopewell muttered, sipping her coffee, while she watched Joy's back at the stove. She was wondering what the child had said to the Bible salesman. She could not imagine what kind of a conversation she could possibly have had with him. He was a tall, gaunt, hatless youth who had called yesterday to sell them a Bible. He had appeared at the door carrying a large black suitcase that weighed him so heavily on one side that he had to brace himself against the door facing. He seemed on the point of collapse, but he said in a cheerful voice, "Good morning, Mrs. Cedars," and set the suitcase down on the mat. He was not a bad-looking young man, though he had on a bright blue suit and yellow socks that were not pulled up far enough. He had prominent face bones and a streak of sticky-looking brown hair falling across his forehead. "I'm Mrs. Hopewell," she said. "Oh," he said, pretending to look puzzled, but with his eyes sparkling, "I saw it said the Cedars on the mailbox, so I thought you was Mrs. Cedars." And he burst out in a pleasant laugh. He picked up the satchel, and under cover of a pant, he fell forward into her hall. It was rather as if the suitcase had moved first, jerking him after it. "Mrs. Hopewell," he said, and grabbed her hand. "I hope you are well." And he laughed again, and then all at once his face sobered completely. He paused and gave her a straight, earnest look and said, "Lady, I've come to speak of serious things." "Well, come in," she muttered, none too pleased because her dinner was almost ready. He came into the parlor and sat down on the edge of a straight chair and put the suitcase between his feet and glanced around the room as if he were sizing her up by it. Her silver gleamed on the 2 sideboards. She decided he had never been in a room as elegant as this. "Mrs. Hopewell," he began, using her name in a way that sounded almost intimate, "I know you believe in Christian service." "Well, yes," she murmured. "I know," he said, and paused, looking very wise with his head cocked on one side, "that you're a good woman. Friends have told me." Mrs. Hopewell never liked to be taken for a fool. "What are you selling?" she asked. "Bibles," the young man said, and his eye raced around the room before he added, "I see you have no family Bible in your parlor. I see that is the one lack you got." Mrs. Hopewell could not say, "My daughter is an atheist and won't let me keep the Bible in the parlor." She said, stiffening slightly, "I keep my Bible by my bedside." This was not the truth. It was in the attic somewhere. "Lady," he said, "the Word of God ought to be in the parlor." "Well, I think that's a matter of taste," she began. "I think—" "Lady," he said, "for a Christian, the Word of God ought to be in every room in the house besides in the heart. I know you're a Christian because I can see it in every line of your face." She stood up and said, "Well, young man, I don't want to buy a Bible, and I smell my dinner burning." He did not get up. He began to twist his hands, and looking down at them, he said softly, "Well, lady, I'll tell you the truth. Not many people want to buy one nowadays, and besides, I know I'm real simple. I don't know how to say a thing but to say it. I'm just a country boy." He glanced up into her unfriendly face. "People like you don't like to fool with country people like me." "Why," she cried, "good country people are the salt of the earth. Besides, we all have different ways of doing. It takes all kinds to make the world go round. That's life." "You said a mouthful," he said. "Why, I think there aren't enough good country people in the world," she had said, stirred. "I think that's what's wrong with it." His face had brightened. "I didn't introduce myself," he said. "I'm Manly Pointer, from out in the country round Willowhoby. Not even from a place, just from near a place." "You wait a minute," she said. "I have to see about my dinner." She went out to the kitchen and found Joy standing near the door where she had been listening. "Get rid of the salt of the earth," she said, "and let's eat." Mrs. Hopewell gave her a pained look and turned the heat down under the vegetables. "I can't be rude to anybody," she murmured, and went back into the parlor. He had opened the suitcase and was sitting with a Bible on each knee. "I appreciate your honesty," he said. "You don't see any more real honest people unless you go way out in the country." "I know," she said. "Real genuine folks." Through the crack in the door she heard a groan. "I guess a lot of boys come telling you they're working their way through college," he said. "But I'm not going to tell you that." "Somehow," he said, "I don't want to go to college. I want to devote my life to Christian service. See," he said, lowering his voice, "I got this heart condition. I may not live long. When you know it's something wrong with you and you may not live long, well then, lady," he paused with his mouth open and stared at her. He and Joy had the same condition. She knew that her eyes were filling with tears, but she collected herself quickly and murmured, "Won't you stay for dinner? We'd love to have you," and was sorry the instant she heard herself say it. "Yes, ma'am," he said in an abashed voice. "I would sure love to do that." Joy had given him one look on being introduced to him, and then throughout the meal had not glanced at him again. He had addressed several remarks to her, which she had pretended not to hear. Mrs. Hopewell could not understand deliberate rudeness, although she lived with it, and she felt she had always to overflow with hospitality to make up for Joy's lack of courtesy. She urged him to talk about himself, and he did. He said he was the seventh child of 12, and that his father had been crushed under a tree when he himself was 8 years old. He had been crushed very badly, in fact, almost cut in two, and was practically not recognizable. His mother had got along the best she could by hard working, and she had always seen that her children went to Sunday school and that they read the Bible every evening. He was now 19 years old, and he had been selling Bibles for 4 months. In that time he had sold 77 Bibles and had the promise of 2 more sales. He wanted to become a missionary because he thought that was the way you could do most for people. "He who loses his life shall find it," he said, simply, and he was so sincere, so genuine and earnest that Mrs. Hopewell could not for the world have smiled. He prevented his peas from sliding onto the table by blocking them with a piece of bread, which he later cleaned his plate with. She could see Joy observing sideways how he handled his knife and fork, and she saw too that every few minutes the boy would dart a keen, appraising glance at the girl as if he were trying to attract her attention. After dinner Joy cleared the dishes off the table and disappeared, and Mrs. Hopewell was left to talk with him. He told her again about his childhood and his father's accident, and about various things that had happened to him. Every 5 minutes or so she would stifle a yawn. He sat for 2 hours, until finally she told him she must go because she had an appointment in town. He packed his Bibles and thanked her and prepared to leave, but in the doorway he stopped and wring her hand and said that not on any of his trips had he met a lady so nice as her, and he asked if he could come again. She had said she would always be happy to see him. Joy had been standing in the road, apparently looking at something in the distance when he came down the steps toward her, bent to the side with his heavy valise. He stopped where she was standing and confronted her directly. Mrs. Hopewell could not hear what he said, but she trembled to think that what Joy would say to him. She could see that after a minute Joy said something, and that then the boy began to speak again, making an excited gesture with his free hand. After a minute Joy said something else, at which the boy began to speak once more. Then, to her amazement, Mrs. Hopewell saw the two of them walk off together toward the gate. Joy had walked all the way to the gate with him, and Mrs. Hopewell could not imagine what they had said to each other, and she had not yet dared to ask. Mrs. Freeman was insisting upon her attention. She had moved from the refrigerator to the heater so that Mrs. Hopewell had to turn and face her in order to seem to be listening. "Glenyce gone out with Harvey Hill again last night," she said. "She had this sty—" "Hill?" Mrs. Hopewell said absently. "Is that the one who works in the garage?" "No, he's the one that goes to chiropractor school," said Mrs. Freeman. "She had the sty, been had it 2 days. So she says when he brought her in the other night, he says, 'Let me get rid of that sty for you.' And she says, 'How?' And he says, 'You just lie yourself down across the seat of that car, and I'll show you.' So she done it, and he popped her neck. Kept on a-popping it several times until she made him quit. This morning, Mrs. Freeman said, she ain't got no sty. She ain't got no traces of a sty." "I never heard of that before," Mrs. Hopewell said. "He asked her to marry him before the ordinary," Mrs. Freeman went on, "and she told him she wasn't going to be married in no office." "Well, Glenyce is a fine girl," Mrs. Hopewell said. "Glenyce and Caramay are both fine girls." Caramay said when her and Lyman was married, Lyman said it sure felt sacred to him. He said he wouldn't take $500 for being married by a preacher. "How much would he take?" the girl asked from the stove. "He said he wouldn't take $500, Mrs. Freeman repeated. "Well, we all have work to do," Mrs. Hopewell said. "Lyman said it just felt more sacred to him," Mrs. Freeman said. "The doctor wants Caramay to eat prunes. Says instead of medicine. Says them cramps is coming from pressure. You know where I think it is?" "She'll be better in a few weeks," Mrs. Hopewell said. "In the tube," Mrs. Freeman said, "else she wouldn't be as sick as she is." Hulga had cracked her 2 eggs into a saucer and was bringing them to the table along with a cup of coffee that she had filled too full. She sat down carefully and began to eat, meaning to keep Mrs. Freeman there by questions if for any reason she showed an inclination to leave. She could perceive her mother's eye on her. The first roundabout question would be about the Bible salesman, and she did not wish to bring it on. "How did he pop her neck?" she asked. Mrs. Freeman went into a description of how he had popped her neck. She said he owned a '55 Mercury, but that Glenyce said she would rather marry a man with only a '36 Plymouth, who would be married by a preacher. The girl asked what if he had a '32 Plymouth, and Mrs. Freeman said that what Glenyce had said was a '36 Plymouth. Mrs. Hopewell said there were not many girls with Glenyce's common sense. She said what she admired in those girls was their common sense. She said that reminded her that they had had a nice visitor yesterday, a young man selling Bibles. "Lord," she said, "he bored me to death, but he was so sincere and genuine I couldn't be rude to him. He was just good country people, you know," she said, "just the salt of the earth." "I seen him walk up," Mrs. Freeman said, "and then later I seen him walk off." And Hulga could feel the slight shift in her voice, the slight insinuation that he had not walked off alone, had he? Her face remained expressionless, but the color rose into her neck, and she seemed to swallow it down with the next spoonful of egg. Mrs. Freeman was looking at her as if they had a secret together.